They beat her in the street while the whole town watched. Not one man stepped forward. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, not a single soul who had eaten bread she baked or worn clothes her hands had sewn. They stood there, boots in the dirt, hats pulled low, and they watched Holden Graves turn a widow into a warning. She was 26 years old. She had done nothing wrong. And she was dying in the dust when the sound of a single horse changed everything. If you've ever been counted out, left behind, or told your life doesn't matter, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The trouble with Black Hollow was that it looked decent from a distance. Riding in from the east along the old post road, a stranger might see the church steeple cutting white against a pale Texas sky, the general store's painted sign swinging easy in the breeze, children chasing dogs through the side lots. They might think, here's a town that has found its footing. Here is a place with order. But order and justice are two entirely different animals, and Black Hollow had only ever managed one of them. Clara Whitmore had lived in this town for 4 years, long enough to know exactly what it was, long enough to have stopped being surprised by it. She had arrived as a new bride at 22, trailing behind her husband Thomas with nothing but a cedar chest, a set of good needles, and the particular brand of hope that only very young women carry, the kind that hasn't yet been educated by the world. Thomas was a kind man, not a strong one, not a rich one, but kind in the way that mattered most. He never raised his voice at her, never made her feel small, always saved the last biscuit. He worked the livery stable 6 days a week and spent Sunday afternoons teaching her the names of stars she'd never see clearly through the dust. She loved him the way a person loves something they know is fragile, carefully, and with a quiet fear underneath. He was dead inside 2 years. The fever came through Black Hollow like it owned the place, swept through 4 families on the south end of town, and took Thomas Whitmore with it on a Thursday in October. It did not ask permission. It did not care that Clara had nothing else. After the burial, she had approximately $11, a house with a leaking roof, and a town full of people who offered condolences for 2 weeks and then quietly forgot she existed. She did not allow herself to fall apart. She couldn't afford to. Clara had grown up poor enough to know that grief was a luxury with a time limit. You cried until you couldn't, and then you got up and figured out what came next. What came next, in her case, was sewing. She had always been good with her hands. Her mother had seen to that. And within a month of Thomas's funeral, she was taking in alterations, making shirts, patching denim, letting out waistbands for the men who'd eaten well through winter. It wasn't dignified work in the way that Black Hollow measured dignity, but it kept the roof patched and her belly from going completely empty. She also cleaned houses. 3 mornings a week, she worked for the Abernathy family on the north side, hauled water, scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, beat rugs until the dust rose in clouds around her. Mrs. Abernathy was a pinched, disappointed woman who spoke to Clara the way she spoke to the furniture. Not unkindly exactly, just without any particular acknowledgement that Clara was a person. Clara took the coins and thanked her and went home. It was a life, small and hard-edged and mostly without color, but it was hers, and she had built it herself. And that counted for something. The first time she saw Holden Graves, she felt the particular unease of recognizing a certain kind of man before he has properly introduced himself. He was 24 or 25, with the soft, well-fed look of someone who had never gone hungry. His father, Randall Graves, owned the largest mercantile operation in the county. Dry goods, grain, lumber, a finger in every commerce pie within 30 miles. This made the Graves family the closest thing Black Hollow had to royalty, and Holden wore that inheritance the way some men wear a gun they've never actually had to use. Loudly, carelessly, pointed at anyone who didn't step aside fast enough. She'd seen him around town for weeks before the first incident. He had a way of standing in doorways so that women had to ask him to move. He had a laugh that arrived at wrong moments and stayed too long. His 2 companions, ranch hands named Dalt and Rue, both big and simple and utterly devoted to whoever was buying their whiskey, followed him everywhere like dogs that had been taught to be mean. Clara had registered all of this and given him a wide berth, which is the sensible thing to do with a man like Holden Graves, but there are some men who interpret the absence of attention as an insult. It started in Kellerman's Dry Goods on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Clara was at the counter pricing thread when Holden came in with Dalt half a step behind. He moved up beside her, too close, shoulder nearly touching, and picked up a spool she'd just set down. "You need this?" he said. "I was looking at it," she said. She kept her eyes on the counter. "I'll buy it for you." He set it down in front of her like it was a gift. "I'll buy you whatever you need. You just have to be a little friendlier about it." She looked at him then, directly, which she knew was a mistake even as she did it. "I don't need anything from you." Something shifted in his face. It was small and quick, like a crack in plaster, there and then papered over with a smile. "Don't be like that," he said. "We're neighbors. I'm just being neighborly." "I appreciate it," she said, in the tone of voice that means I do not appreciate it. She picked up the thread herself, paid Mr. Kellerman, and left. She thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the following 2 weeks, Holden Graves turned up in her proximity with unnerving frequency. At the water pump, outside the Abernathy house when she was leaving, twice on the road between town and her place. He never touched her. Not yet. But the presence itself was a kind of pressure, a reminder that he had decided to notice her and that she had not been consulted in that decision. The second incident happened on a Friday, outside the post office, with a small audience. Holden appeared at her elbow as she was sorting through 3 weeks of unremarkable mail. He said something she didn't catch, something low and meant only for her, and when she stepped back from him, he stepped forward, and when she said his name in a warning tone loud enough for Mrs. Pryor and old Jim Haskett to hear, his expression went flat. What she said next, she would later struggle to remember the exact words, was something along the lines of, "Get away from me, or I will make sure every person in this town knows what kind of man you are." It probably wasn't the smartest thing she'd ever said, but she had been a widow for 2 years. She was tired and worn down and had very little left to lose, and some sentences just come out. Holden Graves went white and then red. Mrs. Pryor touched her collar. Old Jim Haskett found somewhere else to be. Holden didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment with those flat, pale eyes, and then he turned and walked away with Dalt at his heels. That night, Clara told herself it was over. She even managed to believe it, mostly, because it was easier than the alternative. The accusation came on a Monday. She heard the noise before she understood it. Boots on the boardwalk, raised voices. The specific quality of a crowd gathering that always meant something had gone wrong or was about to. She was carrying a bundle of finished shirts toward Kellerman's when she turned the corner onto Main Street and walked straight into it. The whole town was out, or near enough. 20, 30 people clustering in the wide dirt road, shifting and murmuring. At the center of the cluster stood Holden Graves, and his face was arranged into an expression of profound injury that Clara recognized immediately as constructed. Beside him stood his father, Randall Graves, a broad, prosperous man with the practiced dignity of someone accustomed to being believed. "There she is," Holden said. Every face turned to her. Clara stopped walking. "There's the woman who went into my father's office and stole $60 from the strongbox," Holden said, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "I watched her do it. Dalt watched her do it. We can both testify." The silence that followed had a specific weight. Clara felt it on her sternum. "That's a lie," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not expected it to be. "The box was open. The money's gone. You were seen. I have never set foot in your father's office. I have never—" "Dalt," Holden said. Dalt stepped forward. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with a face that had been hit enough times to rearrange itself. "Saw her myself," he said. "Tuesday afternoon. She came in the back." "Rue saw it too," Holden added. Rue nodded from somewhere in the crowd. Clara looked around the gathered faces. She knew most of these people. She had sewn their shirts and cleaned their floors and handed them thread through Kellerman's window. She looked for someone who might speak, who might say, "Wait," or "That doesn't sound right," or anything at all. Nobody said anything. "I didn't steal your money," she said. "I didn't steal anything. These men are lying, and anyone here who knows me knows—" "Sheriff," Holden raised his voice toward the far end of the street. Sheriff Dale Potts was a lean, tired man in his 50s who had held this job for 11 years on the strength of causing as little trouble as possible. He moved through the crowd slowly, thumbs in his belt, and stood between the two of them with the careful neutrality of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for events to catch up. Clara said, he said, not unkindly, which made it worse. I didn't do this. There are witnesses, Potts said. There are liars, she said. There's a difference. She looked at him directly. You know what this is. You know exactly what this is. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He looked away. What happened next was fast. She barely registered Holden's hand on her arm before Dalt had the other one, and then she was moving, being moved, and the crowd was pulling back to make room the way crowds always do. The silent, instinctive choreography of people who are about to watch something they don't want to stop. They dragged her into the street. The first blow knocked her to one knee and knocked the bundle of shirts from her hands. She heard them hit the dirt. She heard someone in the crowd make a small sound. Not protest, just surprise. She tried to get up, got her feet under her, and then Dalt hit her from the side and she went down hard enough to feel the impact in her teeth. She did not scream. She decided that immediately, some cold, stubborn part of her brain that refused to give them that. She fought instead, clawing, kicking, getting her elbow into something that made Dalt grunt. She bit Rue's wrist when he grabbed her hair. He swore and hit her twice across the face. Holden didn't hit her himself. He stood back and watched with his arms crossed, directing it like a man overseeing a job he'd been wanting done for a while. At some point, she stopped being able to count the blows. The dirt was close and she was having trouble breathing. Ribs. Something was wrong with her ribs. Each inhale felt like swallowing broken glass. She got her palms under her and pushed herself up, and someone kicked her arms out from under her and she went back down. She lay in the street and stared at the sky, which was pale and enormous and utterly indifferent. The crowd watched. The sheriff watched. Nobody moved. Clara pressed her cheek against the dirt and closed her eyes and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 2 years of hard, determined, solitary survival. She felt the edges of despair. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the quiet and terrible sensation of realizing that the world has already decided the outcome and there is nothing left in you strong enough to argue. She had survived Thomas dying. She had survived poverty and loneliness and the slow indignity of being invisible. She had done all of it alone because that was what was required of her, and none of it had prepared her for lying in the dirt while people she knew watched and did nothing. This is how I die, she thought, not with any particular drama, just the flat acknowledgement of it. Then she heard the horse. It came from the east end of town, not running, not thundering, just moving at an easy walk that was somehow louder than it should have been, like the sound-filled space, like everything else had gone slightly quieter to accommodate it. She turned her head and saw him through a blur of blood and grit. He was perhaps 35, not remarkable to look at from a distance. Medium height, trail dusty, wearing a long coat the color of a thundercloud. But he was sitting very still on his horse in a way that people who carry authority always sit. Not tense, not aggressive, just present in a way that announced itself without words. His eyes moved across the scene slowly. They settled on her. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Holden Graves. He looked at the sheriff. Then he swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, dropped the reins over the hitching post without looking at it, and walked toward her through the crowd, which actually parted, as though it had agreed to this arrangement in advance. He crouched beside her in the dirt. He had gray eyes, she noticed, the kind of gray that was almost silver in certain light, and they were studying her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity. Something more careful than that. Something that looked oddly like recognition. "Can you hear me?" he said. "Yes." Her voice was rougher than she expected. "Can you move?" She tried. Her ribs screamed. She made it to one elbow. "Mostly. I'm going to help you up," he said. Not a question, just information. She was about to say, "I can do it myself," because she always said that, because that had been the operating principle of her entire adult life. And then her body reminded her with considerable force that it could not, in fact, do it itself, and she closed her mouth. He slid his arm under her carefully, the way a person handles something that has already been broken, and got her upright. She leaned against him for one moment, just one, just until the world stopped tilting, and felt how still he was, like a wall. He turned, still holding her arm, and looked at Holden Graves. The whole street was silent. "You do this?" the stranger said. Holden straightened. He had the type of confidence that functions well when unchallenged, which is to say it collapsed slightly around the edges when this man looked at him. "This is a town matter," Holden said. "Not your business." "I'm making it my business." No elevation in the voice, no performance, just the simple announcement of a fact. Holden's gaze flicked to the sheriff. Sheriff Potts was looking at his boots. "She's a thief," Holden said. "She was caught stealing." "What did she steal?" $60 from my father's. Where's the proof?" "I have 2 witnesses." "Those men?" The stranger glanced at Dalton Rue with an expression of such complete and undisguised assessment that both of them took a half step back. Then he looked at Holden. "You beat a woman in the street over $60 you can't prove she took." The word beat in his mouth had a specific quality. Not angry, not outraged, just precise. Like naming an object. "This is what happened. This is what you are." Holden's face went through several calculations. He had come to this moment expecting a particular kind of ending, the one where authority backed him up. The crowd confirmed his story, and the woman in the dirt understood her place in the order of things. He had not planned for interference from outside the script. "You'd best move on," Holden said. He tried to put command into it and fell short. "This doesn't concern you." "She says she didn't take the money." "Of course she says that." The stranger looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at the sheriff, who was still studying his boots with tremendous focus. Then at the crowd. Slow, sweeping, not hostile, just seeing, recording. Nobody spoke. "All right," the stranger said. He turned back to Clara. "I'm going to take you somewhere you can be looked after, if that's all right with you." She looked at him. She looked at the crowd around her, all those familiar, averted faces. She looked at the shirts she'd sewn scattered in the dirt, weeks of work, and felt the last reasonable argument against accepting help dissolve somewhere in her chest. "All right," she said. He helped her toward his horse. The crowd watched. Holden Graves said something sharp and angry that she didn't fully hear, and the stranger paused for just a moment, his back to Holden, his jaw moving slightly, working something out. And then he kept walking. At the horse, he stopped and looked at her. "I'm Cole Mercer," he said. "Clara Whitmore. Can you ride?" "Not without help." "I'll get you up," he said. He did, carefully, with 2 hands, no wasted motion, and then swung up behind her. She sat stiff and hurting in the saddle, trying not to lean into him, and he gathered the reins around her and said quietly, just to her, "You won't stand alone again." She didn't say anything. Her ribs hurt too much, and her throat was too tight, and she wasn't sure she believed him anyway. She had learned at considerable cost not to believe things people said too easily, but she filed the words away. In some back corner of herself that wasn't all bruise and exhaustion, she filed them away. The horse moved out of Black Hollow at a walk. She didn't look back. She was afraid of what her face might do if she did. They rode in silence for a long time, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. Clara was not a woman who found silence easy with strangers. She filled gaps with practical chatter, talk of weather, of work, of the unremarkable logistics of living, because silence felt like an invitation for the other person to decide things about her. But this man apparently had no inclination to fill space unnecessarily, and after a while she found herself matching his rhythm without meaning to, just watching the land move past and letting her heartbeat slow. The pain was persistent and specific. 3 ribs, she suspected. Not broken, or at least she told herself not broken, because she couldn't afford for them to be broken. Bruising across her left cheekbone, cut above her brow. Her hands, where the dirt had scraped them when she fell. Nothing she hadn't had before, in smaller doses, in the ordinary collisions of a hard life. Nothing she couldn't work around. She repeated this to herself several times. "You need to breathe more than that," Cole said. She glanced sideways at him. "I'm breathing." "Barely. You're working around the ribs. Take the air in full and let it hurt. It's better than starving the blood." She wanted to object that she knew perfectly well how to manage her own breathing, but he was right, and she was stubborn enough to admit when something was correct, even when she resented it. She took a careful, full breath and felt the ribs flare sharp and immediate. "Good," he said. "It hurts," she said flatly. "It's supposed to. Means they're doing their job." That's a bleak way to look at pain. Maybe, He didn't say anything else for a minute. Then, "You knew those men were lying." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Of course I knew. The sheriff knew too." "Yes. And he didn't do anything."
"No."
She paused.
"He won't. He never does. Randall Graves owns half this county, and Dale Potts would like to keep his job and his house and his peace and quiet more than he'd like to do right." She said it without bitterness, or tried to. It was just the operational reality of Black Hollow, no more emotional than describing the weather. "I've been here 4 years. I know how it works." Cole was quiet for a while. The horse moved through scrub grass and mesquite, and somewhere to the north a hawk was working the thermals in long, patient circles. Clara watched it without looking like she was watching it. "Why didn't you leave?" he said. It was a reasonable question, and a complicated one. She considered the easy answer, "Where would I go?" and set it aside in favor of the true one. "Thomas is buried there," she said. "My husband. He died 2 years ago." She paused. "I know that probably sounds foolish." "It doesn't." "It does. A little. He's dead. He doesn't know where I am." She shifted her weight carefully, accommodating the ribs. "But I wasn't ready to leave him behind too. Everything else got taken. The house, the money, the life we were building. I wanted to keep that one thing." Cole didn't respond with the usual sympathetic noises. He just let it sit there, and she appreciated that more than she could have said. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My place. East of here, up in the hills. Not fancy, but there's a roof and a stove and room enough. I can't," she started to say, "I can't impose," and then stopped, because what was the alternative? Go back to Black Hollow, go back to her leaking house and her bundle of scattered shirts and the knowledge that Holden Graves was not finished. "I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be. You don't know that. You don't know me." "No," he agreed, "but you didn't steal that money." "How do you know?" He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. He wasn't the kind of man who answered things quickly just to have an answer. "Man like that one," he said finally, "already owns everything. He didn't do this because of $60. He did it because you said no to him. You can read a man's reasons on his face if you know what to look for." She thought about Holden's face in the street, the performance of injury so badly constructed over the actual thing underneath, which was anger and wounded pride. She thought about how she'd seen it and named it, and told herself she was imagining things. "I should have been more careful," she said. "Probably." He didn't soften it with anything else, and she found she didn't want him to. "Doesn't mean you deserved what happened." "No," she said. "I didn't." Saying it out loud was harder than she expected. She'd known it intellectually. She had done nothing wrong, had committed no sin, had simply refused a man who felt entitled to her compliance. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and being able to state it plainly, without apology or qualification, as simply true. She had spent 2 years in that town apologizing for her own existence in small ways, making herself smaller, quieter, less of an inconvenience, and some of that had gotten tangled up in what happened today in a way she'd have to untangle later. But not now. Now she just breathed through the ribs and watched the hawk and let the horse carry her away from Black Hollow. The road climbed as the afternoon stretched long and orange around them, mesquite giving way to cedar and limestone, the sky going deep gold in the west. Clara had stopped speaking 20 minutes ago, not out of coldness, but because the pain and the exhaustion were running the numbers on her remaining energy and finding a deficit. She was doing the thing she always did when she was too tired to maintain the performance of being fine, going very still and quiet and waiting for it to pass. Cole seemed to understand this without being told. He didn't push conversation. He adjusted his grip when she listed slightly. Once, when they crossed a rocky stretch and the horse's footing became uneven, he put his arm across her briefly. Just a steadying touch, brief and without any particular weight to it, gone as soon as the ground leveled, and she was too tired to find it anything but practical. She noticed his hands, holding the reins, scarred, with the specific patterning of work done over many years. Not ranch work, she thought. The calluses were in different places. Something about his posture, even in the saddle, the way he kept his attention slightly wider than a civilian's, the economy of how he moved. She filed it away. She was a woman who noticed things.
It had been more useful to her than almost anything else in her life. She'd ask later, if there was a later worth asking in. The ranch came into view as the last light was draining from the sky, and her first thought was that it looked like something that had given up and then been interrupted mid-collapse. The main house was solid enough, good stone foundation, but the porch railing had lost its argument with gravity on the left side, and the barn doors hung open at an angle that suggested the hinges had been broken long enough to forget what closed felt like. The garden along the south wall was dead in the particular way of something that had once been tended and then thoroughly abandoned. But the roof looked sound. The chimney was intact. The stove, she suspected, worked. It needs some attention, Cole said. I can see that. I've been managing. She looked at him. He was looking at the house with an expression she recognized, the particular face of a person looking at something they can't quite see clearly because they've stopped really looking at it. Like he'd been here so long that the state of the place had become invisible to him, just background to whatever was actually happening in his head. I'll take care of myself, she said. You don't need to worry about keeping me comfortable. He glanced at her. That's not what I know. She cut it off, not unkindly. I just mean I'm not a guest. I'll earn my keep. He was quiet for a moment. Then, let's get you inside first. We can argue about earning keeps when you can take a full breath without flinching. She was going to object to that too, and then she took an experimental breath, and the ribs took their position known loudly, and she decided to let him have this one. Inside, the house was cleaner than the exterior suggested, though dark and smelling of wood ash and disuse. He lit a lamp without fumbling, started a fire in the stove with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and found a basin and water and clean cloth without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands, which were still shaking slightly, though she hadn't noticed until just now. Small betrayals, the body. She'd stopped them trembling by the time he set the basin in front of her. The ribs need wrapping, he said. You'll need to tell me if you want me to help with that or manage it yourself. I can manage, she said immediately. He set the cloth and the bandage strips on the table beside her and didn't push. He turned to make coffee, actual coffee, which she hadn't had in 2 weeks, and gave her his back with something that felt deliberate, like a courtesy. She worked the binding around herself in the cramped, careful way of a person who has learned to do most things without assistance, and thought about the day she'd just survived and tried to decide what she felt about it. Grateful, she identified with some reluctance. She was alive and indoors, and someone had seen what happened to her and named it correctly and brought her somewhere with a roof. Those were facts not to be dismissed. Angry. Oh, she was angry. The anger was clean and cold and would probably be useful later, but for now it sat beneath the surface and waited its turn. Afraid. She admitted this one privately, where she didn't have to put a face on it. Holden Graves was not the kind of man who was improved by public humiliation, and today in that street she had seen something in his face that told her this wasn't finished. She didn't know what he would do next. She didn't know if Cole Mercer's presence would matter to him, or for how long. She knotted the bandage and pulled her shirt back into order. Coffee's ready, Cole said without turning around. Thank you. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and took the chair across the table. He looked tired, she noticed. Not the tired of a long day's riding, but the older kind. The kind that lived behind the eyes and didn't fully go away with sleep. She'd seen that particular exhaustion on people who'd lost something they couldn't replace. What brought you to Black Hollow? She asked. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Passing through? You weren't headed anywhere specific? A pause. I was headed to the next place. I do that sometimes. He said it like it was a weather report, like it was just a thing that happened. She thought about asking more and decided not to. There would be time for that, or there wouldn't. Right now, they were just 2 people at a table with coffee, and that was enough. Thank you, she said again. Not for the coffee, for everything. He looked at her across the table and nodded once, a small, clean acknowledgement. Get some sleep when you can, he said. You'll hurt worse tomorrow before it gets better. I know. There's a room at the back with a decent bed. She nodded. She finished the coffee slowly. The fire in the stove made the room warm and the lamp made it amber, and outside the Texas night was absolute and dark, and somewhere out there Holden Graves was nursing his pride and plotting his next move, and the world was exactly as dangerous as it had always been. But tonight, she was not in the street. Tonight she was at a table, with a cup of something warm. It wasn't everything, but it was for now something. Clara Whitmore drank the last of her coffee, set the cup down, and went to find the room with the decent bed. She hurt worse the next morning, just like he said. Clara lay on the narrow bed in the back room and stared at the ceiling and took inventory. Ribs. Worse, yes, a deep ache that had settled in overnight and made itself at home. Left cheek, swollen enough that she could feel the puffiness at the edge of her vision. Palms. Scabbed over. Back. Sore in 2 or 3 places she hadn't noticed the night before, which was the body's way of presenting its full accounting only after the emergency had passed. She lay still for a moment and let herself feel all of it without making it mean anything. Pain was information. Pain was just the body doing its bookkeeping. Then she got up. It took longer than it should have. She had to roll to her side first, get her feet to the floor, push herself upright in stages. She stood in the gray morning light of the small room and breathed through the first wave of protest from her midsection and looked around. The room was spare. Bed, side table, a wooden chair with a coat draped over it that wasn't hers. No personal touches. Nothing on the walls. It had the quality of a room that hadn't been used in a while, dusted mechanically but not inhabited. She straightened the bedclothes because it was something she could do without bending, pulled her hair back with fingers that still ached, and went to find the rest of the house. Cole was already up. She could smell coffee before she reached the kitchen and found him at the stove with his back to the door, still in yesterday's clothes, which meant he'd either slept in them or hadn't slept. She suspected the latter. He had the slightly over-precise movements of a person who was compensating for tiredness with deliberateness. "You should have slept," she said. He turned around. Whatever he thought about how she looked, he kept it behind his eyes. "You either. Sit down. I'm fine standing. You're favoring the left side and your jaw's still swollen. Sit down." She sat, partly because he was right, and partly because standing was requiring more effort than she wanted to admit. He put coffee and a plate of something, biscuits, left over from whenever, slightly hard, in front of her and took the chair across the table again. Same position as last night. She had the impression it was probably his default seat, that he sat there alone most mornings and looked at that wall. They ate without talking for a while. The biscuits were dry, but she was hungry enough to eat through it. Outside, the morning light was coming up pale through the window over the sink, and somewhere beyond the barn a bird was making a consistent, irritating noise that it showed no signs of stopping. "What kind of bird is that?" she said. Cole listened. "Curve-billed thrasher. It'll quit in an hour or so." "Does it do this every morning?" "Most of them." She nodded and finished the biscuit. The coffee was strong, and she held the cup in both hands and let it warm her palms. "Tell me about this place," she said. "How long have you been here?" Something shifted in his posture. Not much. Just a slight stilling, the way a person goes a little careful when a question gets close to something they'd rather not disturb. 3 years near enough." "Alone?" He looked at his cup. "Alone." She registered the weight behind that word and decided not to walk directly at it. "The ranch? Is it working land?" "Was. I've got 6 horses still. Manage enough." He paused. "It's gotten away from me a little." "A little," she said. She didn't say it with judgment. She'd seen the garden, the barn doors, the general sense of a place that had been let go by degrees, each small neglect too minor to address, and all of them together adding up to something substantial. She understood how that happened. It happened when your energy was going somewhere else, when the thing you were managing wasn't the land or the house, but something internal and exhausting and constant. "I can fix the garden," she said. He looked up. "You don't need to do anything." "I know I don't need to. I want to." She set the cup down. "I don't do well with nothing to do. It makes the thinking louder." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face recognized that. South Wall gets the most sun. If anything's still worth saving in that soil, that's where. "I'll look at it today. After you rest." "After breakfast," she countered. He almost said something else, and then he let it go. She filed that away too, that he was a man who chose his battles and was apparently capable of recognizing when he'd already lost one. The garden was worse than it looked from the outside, which was saying something. Whatever had been planted there, tomatoes, she thought, and maybe beans, some herbs along the border, had gone to dry stalks and hard ground. She crouched at the edge of it, ignoring the ribs, and dug her fingers into the soil. It was poor, but not dead. Compacted, drained of what it needed, but there was something still in it. She'd worked worse. She found a hoe in the barn, along with a rake and a broken-handled shovel she could use if she held it differently. She spent the morning breaking up the soil in sections, working slowly, and not because she was being careful with herself. She was not being careful with herself, but because she was thinking, and thinking needed a certain pace. She thought about the practical things, what she'd need to plant if she was going to be here any length of time, where the water source was, whether the soil would take amendment. She thought about Black Hollow and Holden Graves and the scattered shirts in the dirt. She thought about the sheriff's boots, which he'd found so interesting. Once in a while, Cole crossed the yard on some errand, and once in a while he looked at her, but he didn't tell her to stop or ask if she needed help, or treat her like something fragile. And she appreciated all three of those absences. By midday, her ribs had filed a formal complaint, and she sat on the ground beside the garden wall and ate the second leftover biscuit she'd put in her pocket that morning, and drank water from the pump, and felt, not good exactly, but purposeful. There's a difference between the two, and she had learned to take purposeful when good wasn't available. She was sitting like that when Cole came around the corner of the barn, leading one of the horses, a gray, big-shouldered, with a crooked blaze on its face, and stopped when he saw her sitting in the dirt. "Lunch," she said, holding up the biscuit. "I have actual food inside." "I know." She finished the biscuit. "What's the horse's name?" He looked at the gray. "Don't have one." "You have a horse, and you haven't named it?" "I have 6 horses. Naming them gets complicated." "That's not a reason. That's an excuse." She stood up, which took effort she didn't perform visibly, and walked to the horse. It turned its large eye toward her with mild suspicion. She put her palm flat on its neck the way her father had taught her before he died, before everything, when she was young enough that the world still came with instructions. The horse's skin twitched under her hand and then settled. "She's a she," Claire said. "I know." "So name her something." "You do it," he said, like the subject wasn't worth his full attention. "Margaret," Clara said. Cole looked at the horse. The horse looked at Clara. "Margaret," he repeated with the tone of a man who was not going to argue about a horse's name. "It suits her. She has a sensible face." He made a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. It startled him, she thought, like it had surprised him from the inside, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. He took Margaret to the water trough, and Clara went inside to find something to actually make for lunch, because the biscuit situation was clearly unsustainable. The kitchen had provisions, not generous ones, but workable. She found dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, onions that were 2 weeks past ideal, but not yet past saving. She built a fire in the stove and got a pot going and swept the kitchen floor while she waited, because sweeping was something she could do without bending, and the floor needed it badly. She found a crack in the window seal that was letting cold air in along the left side and made a mental note to stuff it with something until it could be properly reglazed. She noticed the lamp wicks needed trimming and the hearth needed cleaning and the shelves needed reorganizing into something logical. She did the things she could do and noted the rest, and by the time Cole came in, she had actual food on the table, not spectacular, but hot and correct. He sat down and looked at the bowl. He looked at the swept floor. He looked at the window stuffed with a strip of cloth. He looked at her. "You've been busy," he said. "I don't know how to be otherwise." She sat across from him and started eating. "The window seal needs proper attention when you have time. The lamp wicks, too." He picked up his spoon. "You don't have to fix things." "I told you this morning I need to do something." She paused. "Besides, you fed me and gave me a bed. This is the least." He ate for a moment. Then, "You've done this before, taken care of a place." "I've taken care of every place I've been in since I was 12 years old," she said. Not with bitterness, just fact. "My mother was sick for a long time. I learned early." He nodded once. She had the impression he was a man who accepted information and sorted it quietly rather than responding to it immediately, which she respected. Most people responded before they'd actually processed what they'd heard. They ate the rest of the lunch without talking, and the silence was the same as last night's. Neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just present. a thing between them that didn't demand management. The days after that had their own rhythm. It wasn't an easy rhythm, and it wasn't a happy one, but it was regular, and regular was something Clara could work with. She healed by degrees, the ribs slowly unlocking, the bruises going through their color progression from purple to green to yellow in the way that bruises always do, like a very slow sunset. She slept better than she expected on the narrow bed in the quiet room, and she chalked this up to exhaustion and the physical labor of the garden, not to anything as complicated as feeling safe. She didn't ask Cole about his past. She was waiting for it to come out in its own time, which is the correct approach with people who carry something, because pushing them at it only makes them carry it further back. Instead, she let the work do what work does, to create proximity, establish a kind of vocabulary that doesn't require words. She learned that he was up before dawn and back from the horses by sunup, that he drank his coffee black and too hot, which struck her as a personality trait, that he fixed things with a kind of grim thoroughness. When he repaired the barn door hinges, he didn't just fix what was broken, he reinforced the frame while he was at it, like he was angry at the weakness and determined to prevent its return. That he checked the perimeter of the property every evening before dark with the casual attentiveness of someone who had been trained to do it and couldn't turn the habit off. She was watching him do this, the evening walkabout, slow and systematic, from the porch one evening about 2 weeks after she'd arrived, when she decided to ask. "Ranger?" she said. He stopped and looked at her. "Texas Ranger," she said. Or something like it. He was quiet for a moment, considering her from the bottom of the porch steps. "Was," he said. "How long?" 7 years. "What made you stop?" The pause that followed was long enough that she thought he might not answer. He came up the steps and leaned against the porch rail, the repaired side, which now held his weight without trouble, and looked out at the darkening land. When he spoke, his voice was level in the way of a man who has said a thing enough times that he sanded all the rawness out of it, but the shape of the wound underneath was still clear if you knew to look. "I had a family," he said. "Wife, 2 kids, 8 and 5. He paused. "I was hunting a gang. Man named Elias Kane. He ran men who robbed stage lines, killed whoever was in the way. I got close enough to scare him." He stopped. Clara didn't move. She didn't say anything. "He came for them while I was in the field," Cole said. "By the time I got back—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. They were gone, all 3 of them. The word "gone" sat between them in the dusk, and neither of them touched it. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it, which meant she said it simply, without decoration. He nodded. "I resigned my commission after. Bought this land." He looked at the house. "I thought—" He paused. "I don't know what I thought. That I could just stop. That I could find somewhere quiet enough." And Kane? Something moved in his eyes. Not quite anger. More like the particular stillness of a wound that has become a defining feature. "He's still out there. I track where he is, best I can. Old habits." A pause. "I tell myself it's just information, knowing where a dangerous man is." Clara heard what he wasn't saying. She heard the 3 years of rattling around this half-dead ranch with that knowledge sitting in him like a splinter that had gone too deep to reach. She heard the difference between a man who had made peace with something and a man who had simply gotten very quiet about it. "And you haven't gone after him," she said. "No." "Because—" He looked at her. "Because the last time I chased Elias Kane, it cost me everything." He said it flatly, the way you say a rule you've written in stone. "I decided the score wasn't worth another round." She sat with that. She thought about what it cost a man to make that decision. A man who had been a ranger, who had built his identity on being the one who went toward the threat, who had watched evil men face consequences and considered that his work in the world. To lay that down, to decide that staying still was the only version of safe left. "But it didn't stop," she said. "Going after him, I mean, the thinking about it." His mouth tightened, not denial, recognition. "No," he said. "It didn't stop." She nodded. She didn't push further. Some truths just needed to be spoken out loud once and then left to settle. The next morning, she found him in the barn teaching her, or starting to. She had wandered in looking for the extra rake and found him at the workbench, and he turned around and looked at her for a moment with some decision already made behind his eyes. "Come here," he said. She came. He held out his pistol. "Grip first, careful." She looked at it. "I've shot before." "How well?" "Well enough to have done it." "That's not an answer." She took the gun. It was heavier than she remembered guns being, or maybe she'd just forgotten. She turned it in her hands, found the balance. "My father had a rifle. I learned on that. I haven't fired anything since he died." "How long ago?" 15 years. He took her out behind the barn and spent the morning teaching her to shoot again, not with patience exactly, which implied tolerance of error, but with a kind of precise insistence, correcting her grip twice, her stance once, the way she was anticipating the shot and flinching before it. He wasn't gentle about the corrections. He wasn't rough either. He was just honest, which she found she preferred to either. Her first 3 shots at the fence post went wide. The 4th clipped the edge. The 5th was close enough. "Again," he said. She fired again. And again. By the time they stopped, her hand was sore from the recoil and her ears were ringing, and she'd hit the post clean 4 times in the last 10. "Not bad," he said. "High praise." "From me it is," he said, and walked back to the barn. She stood there with the gun in her hand and the smell of powder in the air and something shifting slightly in her chest. Not confidence, not yet, just the early rough shape of it, the first recognition that she might be capable of more than she'd thought. He taught her other things too, over the following weeks. How to read a horse's mood from its ears and its breathing and the set of its neck. How to track a rider by the marks left in the soil. How to build a fire in wet conditions. How to move quietly through brush. How to think about exits before she needed them. He taught her the way a person teaches who has learned things the hard way, not theoretically, but in the very specific language of this mistake and what it costs. She asked questions. He answered them. When the answers were incomplete, she pushed at the gaps, and he filled them, with some combination of mild irritation and what she suspected was, underneath it, something like appreciation. She repaired things. The window sill properly this time, with oakum she found in the barn. The porch step that had gone soft. A section of pasture fence Cole had been putting off. She got the garden into real shape, planted beans and squash and the herbs she'd found dried in the kitchen, wondering if they were from the previous garden, from the life this place had held before whatever happened to it. She didn't ask about the wife directly. She learned the edges of her from the way Cole moved around the absence. The empty hook by the door where something used to hang, the specific way he never went into the room at the end of the hall, which was closed and had been closed since Clara arrived. She learned her from the small signs of a life that had been present and then removed. The curtains in the kitchen that were too cheerful and careful to be Cole's choice. The particular placement of the garden, which had been designed by someone who understood light. One evening, late, when they were both sitting on the porch in the cooled-down dark with the coyotes making their noise out in the hills, Cole said, "Her name was Ruth." Clara didn't ask who. "She planted the garden," she said. "Yeah." A pause. The boy was Daniel. The girl was Lucy. Clara held very still. She looked out at the dark hills and held the names carefully, the way you hold something that has been handed to you. "She used to sit out here in the evenings," Cole said. "Same spot you're sitting." "Do you want me to—" "Well, no," he said. "I don't." And then more quietly, "I think I'd forgotten what that spot looked like with someone in it." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. They sat until the coyotes finished and the night settled into its deep quiet, and then she went inside. She heard him stay on the porch for another hour, alone, working through whatever it was he worked through out there. She lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas, about his particular laugh and the way he'd been teaching her the stars. She thought about how grief worked, how it didn't really diminish. It just got heavier and more familiar at the same time, so you stopped noticing the weight as much. And she thought about what it meant to be in a place where someone else was carrying a grief of comparable size, whether that made it better or worse or just different. She thought about Holden Graves too. She thought about him more than she wanted to. He was still out there. She was still the woman who'd humiliated him in front of half the town, and men like Holden did not reclassify that as settled business. She had no illusions about this. Cole had said nothing further about it, But she noticed that the evening perimeter checks had gotten more thorough, that he'd started keeping the rifle inside the house rather than in the barn, that he occasionally paused at the east-facing window and looked down the road with the particular stillness of someone who is not just looking at the landscape. She began to do the same. She did it without announcing it, without making it a conversation. She just started paying attention to the road. There were no threats, not yet. But there is a specific quality to waiting for something you know is coming, a kind of taut alertness that runs underneath the ordinary routine of a day, making everything slightly sharper at the edges. The sound of a horse in the distance, the dust kicked up by a rider on the far ridge. These things meant nothing, probably, but they didn't mean nothing to Clara, and they didn't mean nothing to Cole, and gradually the two of them developed the habit of noticing them together without needing to explain it to each other. The days began to warm as spring pushed toward summer, and the garden came up. First the beans, tentative green shoots against the dark soil, then the squash. Then, unexpectedly and stubbornly, a row of something along the south wall that Clara hadn't planted. Some buried root or seed from the original garden, revived by the loosened soil and the water, insisting on another season. She was crouched over it one morning, trying to identify what it was, when Cole came up behind her and looked over her shoulder. "Tomatoes, he said. "From her garden? Must be." She looked at the small, determined shoots. "They're strong ones." "Ruth had a way with tomatoes," Cole said. He said it without pain, or rather, with the kind of pain that has been integrated, that has become part of the ordinary texture of speaking, rather than something that stops speech. She said the secret was arguing with them. Clara almost smiled. "I can try that." "You're already doing it," he said. "I've heard you out here." "Out." She looked up at him. The morning light was behind him, and she couldn't quite read his expression, but something in the set of his shoulders was different than it had been 2 months ago. Some of the rigidity had moved or shifted. He still carried the grief. She didn't imagine he would ever put it down entirely, but it was sitting differently on him. He looked at the tomato shoots for another moment, and then he looked at her, and whatever he was about to say, he didn't say it. He turned and went back to the horses. Clara stayed crouched by the garden and put her hand flat on the soil, the same way she'd put it on Margaret's neck that first day. The earth was warm under her palm, alive in the way that land is alive when it has been properly attended to, grudgingly, imperfectly, but genuinely. She was not, she realized, waiting for something to end anymore. She was building, slowly and without a clear picture of what it was supposed to look like when it was done, the way real things get built, hand over hand, day by day, from the ground up. She didn't have a name for what was growing between her and Cole, and she was careful not to reach for one. She knew it was real because it wasn't easy, because it arrived sideways, in the hour he spent showing her how to track without asking why she wanted to know. In the morning, he silently rebound her ribs when she'd done it wrong herself. In the way she'd started automatically making 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it. She didn't know what was coming for them. She knew something was. She watered the tomatoes and went inside to start the day. The tomatoes came in strong in late July. Clara had argued with them through 6 weeks of uneven rain and one spell of heat that turned the air above the soil into something you could nearly see. She'd staked them, pruned them, hauled water from the pump in the early mornings before the sun had climbed enough to make the work miserable. They rewarded her with the indifferent productivity of plants that have decided to survive regardless of your feelings about it, which she respected. She and Cole ate the first one standing at the kitchen counter, sliced and salted, without sitting down or making any particular occasion of it. They were good tomatoes. Neither of them commented on whose garden they'd originally come from, and the silence around that fact was a comfortable one by now. One of many silences they had learned to share without filling. The summer had changed things between them. Not dramatically, not with any single moment she could have pointed to, but in the accumulated way that time changes things when 2 people are paying attention to the same life. She knew now that he slept badly on nights when the wind came from the north, that he had a specific way of going still when he was angry that was more unnerving than shouting would have been, that he actually read, worked through books from a crate under his bed, mostly history and law, some surveying texts, and that he sometimes left a book face down on the table when he went out in the morning, and she had started leaving hers there too, like a quiet declaration of continued presence. He knew things about her too, that she talked to the horses when she thought no one was listening, that she kept a folded piece of paper in her shirt pocket, a letter Thomas had written her, worn thin at the creases, and touched it sometimes when she didn't know she was doing it, that she was braver about most things than she gave herself credit for, and that the one thing that genuinely frightened her was not men or poverty or violence, but the specific terror of being unseen, of mattering to no one. He had never said any of this to her directly, but she was fairly certain he knew it. The shooting practice had become daily. She was good now, not exceptional, but reliable, which Cole said was more useful than exceptional anyway. She could hit a stationary target at 80 yards 9 times out of 10. Moving targets were harder, and she worked at them with the same focused irritation she brought to anything she wasn't yet good at. Cole had stopped correcting her stance 3 weeks ago, which she took as its own kind of acknowledgement. She had also learned to ride properly. She'd always been capable enough in the saddle, but capable and skilled were different things, and Cole taught her the difference the way he taught everything, by putting her in situations that required the skill before she fully had it. He took her out through the hill country, through narrow cedar breaks and rocky crossings, in weather that ranged from pleasant to actively hostile, and he rode beside her and watched and said very little except when something was wrong, which was also how he handled most things in life. Margaret had become genuinely hers in all but paperwork. The horse had settled into Clara's handling with the particular acceptance of an animal that has decided on its own terms that a person is trustworthy. Clara found this more gratifying than she could reasonably explain. It was a good summer. She knew it was a good summer even while it was happening, which is a rare thing. Usually you only understand that something was good after it's over, when you can see the whole shape of it. But she knew. And knowing made her quietly careful about it, the way you're careful with something that feels too valuable to last. She was not wrong about that. The first sign came on a Wednesday in late August, so ordinary in its delivery that she almost missed it. Cole had ridden into the nearest supply point, a small trading post called Burnett's Crossing, half a day east, for flour and ammunition and some other things they'd run low on. He was supposed to return by late afternoon. He returned at midday, moving at a pace that made Clara set down the bridle she was mending before he'd even reached the fence. She read his face the way she'd learned to read it, which was not through what was on it, but through what wasn't. The particular blankness he carried when something was wrong and he was deciding how much to say about it. "What happened?" she said. He dismounted and led the horse through the gate and didn't answer until he'd tied her off. "Ran into a man at Burnett's. Rider named Casper. Used to work a ranch south of here. I knew him before." He paused. "He said there have been men through the area, 3-4 days back, asking questions." Clara was quiet. "Asking about this property, whether anyone was living here, how many?" He looked at her steadily. Casper said they had the look of Cain's men. 2 of them he recognized from wanted paper he'd seen maybe 2 years ago. She absorbed this. She looked at the hills to the east, which were the same hills they'd always been, dry grass and cedar and the occasional limestone shelf, and thought about what it meant that those hills might now contain people looking back. "He found us," she said. "He found the land," Cole said. "He knows I'm here. He's always known, near enough. I was never hiding. I just wasn't worth the trouble." He paused. Something changed his calculation. They both understood what that something probably was. 3 years of Cole staying quiet on this property, posing no threat, drawing no attention. And then in May, he rode into Black Hollow and publicly pulled a woman out of the dirt in front of witnesses. The kind of thing that gets talked about. The kind of thing that travels. "I brought this to you," Clara said. She said it flatly, not as apology exactly, but as accounting. "You didn't bring anything," Cole said. "Cain's been looking for a reason for 3 years. If it wasn't this, it would have been something else." He said it without heat, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. She didn't argue. She also didn't accept it entirely, because accepting it entirely would have required her to stop feeling the particular weight of it, and she thought the weight was appropriate and probably useful. "What do we do?" she said. "We get ready," he said. "We make sure everything we need is where we can reach it. We watch the approaches." He looked at her. "And we don't pretend it isn't coming." She nodded. "All right." They spent the rest of the day with the quiet efficiency of people who have been preparing for a thing and now know the preparation is no longer theoretical. Cole checked every window latch, reinforced the bar on the front door, shifted the rifle rack inside to the wall beside the kitchen rather than the bedroom, accessible from more of the house. He redistributed ammunition into 3 locations she memorized. She checked the barn, confirmed the horses could be moved quickly if needed, identified the 2 exits, and which one was faster in which direction. They did all of this without discussion mostly. An exchange of information here, a question answered there. She felt the alertness in the air between them, not fear, not quite, but the sharp-edged attentiveness that comes when the threat stops being abstract. That night they sat on the porch for a while and watched the dark. And it was a different kind of watching than the peaceful kind they'd done all summer. Cole had the rifle across his knees. Clara had the pistol at her hip. The coyotes were quiet. "How many men does he run?" she asked. "Depends on the job. His core group, 5, 6. He can pull more if he's planning something significant." A pause. "He'd come here with enough to be certain. And we are 2 people. We are 2 people who know this land and they don't," Cole said. "That counts for something." It counted for something, she agreed. She wasn't sure how much. "Cole." She said his name and waited until he looked at her. "I'm not leaving." He was quiet for a moment. "I know. I want to make sure we're clear on that. I'm not going to the next town and waiting somewhere while you—" "I know," he said again. "I stopped thinking about asking you to about 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. "What happened 3 weeks ago?" "You shot a moving target at 60 yards on your first try." The corner of his mouth shifted. "I figured the conversation would be a waste of time." She looked back at the dark hills. The wind moved through the grass in slow, rhythmic waves, and somewhere out beyond the cedar a nighthawk was making its thin cry, and everything looked exactly as it always did, which was the unnerving thing about danger. It so rarely announced itself with any visible change to the scenery. They went inside when the moon was fully up. Clara lay in the dark for a while before sleep came, listening to the house settle around her. She thought about what she was, now, versus what she'd been in May, the woman in the dirt on Main Street, looking up at a pale sky and waiting for what came next. She didn't feel like that woman anymore. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd stopped feeling like her. She touched the folded letter in her pocket. "Thomas," she thought, not as a conversation, but just as a holding of the name, the same way you hold something before putting it down somewhere safe. "I'm all right. I think I'm going to be all right." She slept. The attack came not that week, nor the next. Came on a cold night in October, 3 weeks after Casper's warning. In the particular way that violence comes when it has been planned by someone patient, all at once, from multiple sides, with no preamble. Clara woke to the sound of a horse screaming. She was upright before she was fully conscious, her hand on the pistol before her feet hit the floor, which told her something about who she'd become. The room was lit strange, too orange, flickering. She got to the window and looked out and felt her stomach drop. The barn was on fire. Not a small fire. A fire that had been set and given a head start, flames already climbing the east wall and throwing orange light across the yard in moving sheets. She could hear the horses, all 6 of them, Margaret's high, terrified cry distinct among them. And she was out the door before the first shot came through the kitchen window. The glass exploded inward. She hit the floor by instinct, rolled behind the kitchen table, and heard Cole's voice from the front room. "East and south, at least 4. Stay low." She stayed low. She moved across the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, came up under the far window, looked out at an angle. Muzzle flash from the tree line, 60, 70 yards out. Another from behind the water trough. She counted angles the way Cole had taught her. They'd taken up positions that covered the yard approaches. Smart. Whoever planned this had seen the layout. Another shot punched through the kitchen wall and took a clay pot off the shelf in an explosion of dirt. She flinched and then steadied. Cole was at the front room window, returning fire in controlled pairs. She could hear his breathing, quick but even. She could hear him reloading by feel in the dark, which she knew he could do in under 10 seconds. "How many can you see?" he called. 2 from here, south and southeast. There might be more behind the barn." "There are." A shot. A pause. "I count at least 5 outside, could be more waiting." The barn wall gave a sound like a groan, and a section of the roof caught. The horses were in full panic now, and she thought about them, about Margaret, with a specific helplessness that she filed away because there was no room for it right now. "The horses," she said. "Later," Cole said, and she heard what was underneath it, the knowledge of what it cost him to say it, the deliberate suspension of feeling in service of surviving the next 10 minutes. She found her position at the kitchen window, got her arms up, and fired at the muzzle flash behind the water trough. She didn't hit anyone. The angle was bad, and she knew it. But the return fire from that position paused, and pausing was worth something. Good, Cole said from somewhere he'd moved to. Keep them uncertain about where you are. Don't stay in the same spot. She moved. She went down the hall, came up at the bedroom window, which had a different angle on the south tree line. She found a shape moving between the trees, a man repositioning, thinking he was in shadow. She wasn't thinking about it as a person. She was thinking about it as a problem in geometry, a thing moving between point A and point B. She fired twice. The shape dropped. Her ears were ringing. The room smelled of powder and cedar smoke. I see it, Cole said. He'd moved into the hallway behind her. His voice was close in the dark. There's one more repositioning to the northwest near the fence. He's trying to get an angle on the door. I can't see that from here. I can from the front. When I engage him, you move back to the kitchen. There's another one creeping the south wall. I'll be ready. Clara. He said her name and paused. Don't stand up at the window. Edge only. I know, she said, sharper than she meant to. A beat. I know you know, he said. I just needed to say it. She looked at him in the dark hallway. She could barely see him, just the outline of him, the pale gray of his eyes. She nodded. He went to the front room. She went back to the kitchen. What followed was 20 minutes that she would later struggle to assemble into sequence. There was the second man at the south wall who came up from a crouch, and she put 2 rounds into the wall beside his head, and he broke and ran, which told her something about the quality of men Kane was sending. There was a coordinated push from the east that Cole broke with 3 shots, fast and measured, that she couldn't see but heard like punctuation. There was a moment when the barn roof collapsed entirely in a cascade of sparks and flame, and the resultant light illuminated the entire yard, and she saw, clearly, for 2 full seconds, 2 men in the open, caught wrong, and she and Cole fired simultaneously, and she heard one of them fall. There was a period of maybe 5 minutes where nothing happened at all, which was almost worse. Then there was the fire. Not the barn, this house itself. She smelled it before she saw it, the specific bite of burning cloth, and found it in the back room where she slept. Her room, she thought, still. Something thrown against the exterior wall, a torch or a burning rag, and the curtain had caught. She got the curtain down and beat it out on the floor with her bare hands and burned her left palm and said a word she wouldn't have said 6 months ago. House fire, she called. How bad? Not bad. I got it. We need to move, Cole said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but carrying something underneath it. They're pulling back to regroup. We have maybe 10 minutes before they try something different. We're not staying here for the second attempt. She understood immediately. The horses. The barn wall's down on the north side. If any of them got through the gate, she was already moving. She went out the kitchen door low and fast, the way Cole had made her practice, hugging the wall of the house until she reached the corner. The yard was lit orange and terrible from the burning barn, which was 3/4 gone now, the remaining walls standing like broken teeth. The heat was significant even at this distance. She moved around the yard's edge, staying out of the direct firelight, trying to use the shadows the fire threw rather than fight them. The barn's north gate had held. The latch was still up. She got it open and went inside, which required walking into a wall of heat and smoke that made her eyes stream immediately. She pulled her shirt up over her nose and called out, because horses in a panic will run at anything, including fire, if they can't hear a voice they know. Margaret? Margaret, here. A crashing sound from the back. The big gray throwing herself against the stall slats. Clara got to her by feel and sound, got the stall open, got her arm over the horse's neck. Margaret's skin was sheeted with sweat, and every muscle was rigid with terror, but she knew Clara's weight. She knew Clara's smell. The frantic lurching slowed by a few degrees. We're going, Clara said into her neck. Right now. Come on. She got Margaret out. She got 2 more horses out. The roan and the bay, following Margaret by instinct. The other 3 were gone, she thought, through the fallen south wall and out into the dark already, which was bad but better than the alternative. She came out through the north gate with 3 horses and nearly ran into Cole, who was leading 2 more. The missing ones, he'd apparently found them at the fence line. And they looked at each other across the horse and the burning barn and the ruined yard and did a fast accounting. "Are you hurt?" he said. "Burned my hand." He looked at her hand, he looked at her face. Something in him, some wire-tight thing, relaxed a single degree. "We need to go. Now, while they're regrouped." "Which way?" "North, through the cedar. There's a trail I've used, single file, hard to follow in the dark." He looked at the house. His face did something complicated and brief and then settled back into function. "I need you to trust me." "I do," she said, and meant it without hesitation, which was its own kind of remarkable given where she'd started 5 months ago. He turned and mounted in one movement, and she got up onto Margaret, and they went. 6 horses in a line through the cedar brake, the fire throwing orange behind them and the cold night air coming in fast in front, and somewhere behind them men regrouping in the ruins of a yard that had been, however briefly, a home. She didn't look back. There was a time in her life when she couldn't have done that, when she'd have needed to see the last of a thing before she could leave it. But she'd learned, in the months on that ranch, that looking back while moving forward is how you fall. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. On Cole's back, straight and certain in the dark. On the ground under Margaret's hooves, which was treacherous with rock and root and needed her full attention. They moved through the dark in near silence, just the hooves on stone and the ragged breathing of horses pushed past their comfort. Once, far behind them, she heard a shout, a man's voice, angry and distant, and then nothing. The fire's light diminished behind the trees. Cole set a pace that was careful and fast, which took skill to maintain in the dark, and she matched it. An hour into the ride, when the hills had closed around them properly and the sky was visible in full above the tree break, he slowed to a walk and she pulled up beside him. "How far are they behind?" she asked. "Far enough for now. They won't follow in the dark. They don't know this country." "Where are we going?" "Town called Iron Ridge," he said, "half a day's ride from here. There's a marshal there, I know, Everett Hale. He's the kind of man who's actually what he says he is." A pause. "It's time." She heard the weight of those 2 words. It's time. 3 years of stillness and waiting on that hillside property, and Elias Kane had finally forced the question. She thought about what that meant for Cole, whether he was relieved or terrified or something more complicated than either. "Your hand," he said. "Let me look at it when we stop." "It's fine." "It's burned." "I know what it is." "It's fine." She paused. "I killed someone tonight." He looked at her steadily, matching her pace. "I know. I'm not asking you to—" She stopped. She didn't know exactly what she was asking him to do. "I just needed to say it out loud." "Yeah," he said, not minimizing it, not inflating it, just acknowledging the fact of it. She sat with it. She examined herself for the things she'd expected to feel. The horror, the collapse, the breaking of some interior rule, and found instead something more complicated and less comfortable. Not satisfaction, not guilt exactly either. Something closer to the feeling after a hard and necessary piece of work. Something that would require more thought than she had available tonight. Cole was looking at the trail ahead, but he reached across the space between their horses and briefly, carefully, put his hand on hers. The good one, not the burned one. Just for a moment. Just the simple weight of it. She turned her palm up and held it. The horses moved through the dark, and the cold came down from the hills, and somewhere ahead of them Iron Ridge waited, and behind them what had been a home was ash and ember and a season of ordinary life that was over. Clara Mercer, she wasn't that yet, not by name, rode with her spine straight and her burned hand in her lap and her eyes ahead. She was not the woman who had been left in the dust on Main Street. That woman would not have survived tonight. They rode into Iron Ridge just as the morning light was turning from gray to pale gold. 6 horses that had been pushed through a cold October night, 2 riders who hadn't slept. The town was bigger than Black Hollow and different in the way that mattered. It had the particular quality of a place where the law had been exercised consistently enough that people had started to believe in it. The buildings were solid, the street relatively ordered, and the marshal's office sat square and visible on the main road with a lamp already burning in the window at this hour, which told Clara something about the man inside before she'd seen his face. Cole had not spoken much on the second half of the ride. She hadn't pushed him. She understood that he was somewhere inside himself, working through a geography she hadn't been invited into yet, and that the best thing she could do was ride beside him and leave the door open. Marshall Everett Hale was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a white mustache and the careful, rested eyes of someone who had learned a long time ago that panic was expensive. He opened his office door before they dismounted, took one look at their condition, the horses, the burned hand Clara was holding against her side, Cole's expression, and said, "Get inside, both of you, now." He was the kind of man who fed people before he asked them questions, which Clara respected enormously. There was coffee and cold cornbread, and while she ate, he cleaned and wrapped her burned palm with the efficient competence of someone who had done field medicine many times, and he did it without making a production of it. Cole talked while she ate. He laid it out clean and factual. The warning from Casper, the attack, the fire, the retreat through the cedar. Hale listened the way experienced men listen, without interruption, his face neutral, only his eyes moving. When Cole finished, Hale was quiet for a moment. He refilled his own coffee. He looked at the wall, apparently doing arithmetic. "Kane," he said. "Kane," Cole confirmed. "I've been building a case on his operations for 2 years," Hale said. "Stage robberies, 3 murders I can prove. 2 more I'm fairly certain of." He set the cup down. "I've been waiting for something that would give me grounds to move on him in his territory. He operates out of Canyon Country, southeast of here. Rego Canyon, mostly. It's outside my jurisdiction technically, but if he crossed into my county to attack a private citizen," "He did," Cole said, "then I can deputize a posse and pursue him across the county line." Hale looked at Cole directly. "I want to be clear about something before we go further. I know who you are, Cole. I know what Kane did to your family. I've known about you sitting on that property for 3 years, and I've left you alone because you weren't doing anything wrong." He paused. "I need to know that you're coming into this as a man who wants Kane brought to justice and not as a man who wants Kane dead." The silence that followed had its own specific tension. Clara watched Cole's face. He sat with the question for a long moment. She could see him deciding something, not just what to say, but what was actually true. There was a difference with Cole between those two things, and he always took the time to find it. "I want him to stand in front of a court," Cole said finally. "I want the territory to know what he did, and to name it correctly." A pause. "Whether I'll still feel that way when I'm looking at him across 20 feet of canyon, I can't promise you that, Everett. I'd be lying if I did." Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, with the expression of a man who has decided to trust something he can't fully verify. "Fair enough," he said. "At least you're honest about it." He looked at Clara. "And you?" She met his eyes. "I'll be there to make sure he is," she said. Hale almost smiled. "All right." He stood. "I'll have a posse assembled by midday. 6 men I trust. They've worked with me before. We move out this afternoon, camp at the canyon approach tonight. Move in at first light." "I know the layout of Rego Canyon," Cole said. "I've scouted it twice in the last 3 years." "I know you have," Hale said. "That's why you're leading the approach." Clara looked at Cole. He was looking at the wall again, and she recognized the look now. Not distance exactly, but the particular focus of a man assembling a plan, running the ground in his head, placing men and angles and contingencies. She had watched him do this with fence lines and horse training and kitchen repairs, always the same systematic interior process. Now he was doing it with something that could get them killed, and the process looked exactly the same. She thought, this is who he was before the ranch. This is the whole of him, not just the part he's been living as. She thought, I think I love him. She had been aware of this for a while and had been treating it like something that didn't need to be spoken yet. She put it away again. There was time for that, or there would be after. The posse assembled at noon in front of the marshal's office. 6 men, as Hale had promised, ranging from a quiet former Army scout named Briggs to a hard-faced rancher named Tully, who had his own reasons for wanting Kane's operation finished and didn't offer them and wasn't asked to. They looked at Clara with the particular expression of men who have not planned for a woman's participation and don't know what protocol applies. Cole looked back at them with an expression that closed the question before it was asked. Nobody said anything. They rode south. The canyon country started 2 hours out of Iron Ridge, where the flat grassland gave way to broken limestone ridges and cedar that grew sideways out of rock faces and dry creek beds that could flood fast and without warning. Clara had not been in this territory before. It was beautiful in the way of things that are also dangerous, clean and sharp-edged and completely indifferent to human plans. Cole rode at the front with Hale. Clara stayed in the middle of the column, which was where Hale had placed her, and which she'd accepted without argument because middle of the column was tactical, not protective. She could see forward and backward. She had riders on both flanks, and she was close enough to the front that Cole could reach her in a short sprint if needed. Briggs, the Army scout, rode up alongside her in the mid-afternoon. He was a compact, quiet man with sun-darkened skin and the habit of looking at the surrounding terrain continuously, like a clock that never stops. He hadn't spoken to her since they'd left Iron Ridge. "You're the one from Black Hollow," he said. Not a question. Information being confirmed. "Yes." "Cole pulled you out of the street." "He did." Briggs looked at the terrain ahead. "I served with him years back, before the ranger work. He was the best man I knew at reading a situation before it happened." A pause. "He ever tell you about the Callan ambush?" "No. There were 9 of us. We came into a valley, and Cole stopped us 50 yards from the entrance because something felt wrong to him. He couldn't explain what. Just wrong." Briggs was quiet for a moment. 3 of us went in slow on his word, pulled back at the first shot. We lost nobody." Another pause. "The unit that went in the week before without Cole lost 5. Clara listened. "What I'm saying," Briggs said, "is that when he tells you something is wrong, it's wrong. And when he tells you to move, you move." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said, which was the second time a man had said that to her recently. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He dropped back into the column. She thought about Cole stopping at the valley entrance because something felt wrong. She thought about him standing in the street in Black Hollow, the way he'd read Holden Graves's face, the way he'd read the crowd, the way he'd moved with the particular economy of a man who had learned to see problems slightly before they happened. She'd thought of it as experience. Maybe it was more than that. They camped in a dry creek bed 2 miles from the canyon mouth. No fire. Cold rations, cold water, horses tethered in the cedar where they wouldn't be visible from the ridge above. Hale assigned watches in 2-hour rotations. Cole and Clara ended up on the same watch, middle of the night, second rotation, and sat together in the dark on a limestone shelf above the camp, listening. "Tell me what we're walking into," she said, low. "Kane's main camp is on the canyon floor, about a mile in from the entrance. There are walls on both sides that climb maybe 60 feet. He uses the canyon because the single entrance makes it defensible. 2 or 3 men at the mouth can hold off most approaches." Cole paused. "But the rim is accessible. If we split the group, some on the floor to draw attention, some up top, he loses that advantage. You want to take the rim. I need someone up there I trust to make shots that matter." He looked at her. "I'm asking, not telling." She thought about the rim, the climb, the exposure, the angles. She thought about what he was actually asking, which was whether she could be the person on the high ground with a rifle when it came down to it, not whether she could shoot. She'd answered that question, whether she could hold herself together when the shooting was real and the targets were real and the consequences were real. She'd already answered that question too, last night in the burning house. "I'll take the rim," she said. He nodded. He looked out at the dark canyon country for a while. The stars were thick and cold overhead. Somewhere a mile in, Elias Kane was sleeping in a camp that didn't know yet what was coming. "After this," Cole said. She waited. "I want to rebuild." He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of each word. "Not the same place. Somewhere new, different ground." She looked at him. In the dark she could see the shape of him. The set of his shoulders, slightly less rigid than they'd been 6 months ago, the way he'd gradually been opening up space in himself that had been sealed shut for 3 years. "I'd like that," she said. "I'm not saying it easy," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm still... Ruth and the kids are still..." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to put them down." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you're not." Another pause.
That's part of why. She let that sit. She didn't need more than that, not tonight. Tonight was enough. The dawn came in cold and flat, and they moved before the light had finished arriving.
Hale took 4 men along the canyon floor to Tully and 3 others, moving in slow and low, using the creek bed for cover. Briggs went with Cole and Clara on the rim approach, along with one other man, a young deputy named Sears, who climbed like he'd been doing it since childhood, and who had the loose, easy courage of someone who hadn't yet been badly hurt and didn't know enough to be afraid. The rim climb was 150 feet of crumbling limestone and cedar root in the pre-dawn gray, in silence. Clara went second behind Briggs, who found the holds by instinct and didn't make it look easy because it wasn't easy, but made it look navigable, which was what mattered. She had the rifle slung across her back. Her burned hand pulled when she gripped, a consistent complaint she noted and filed and pushed past. At the top, flat on the rim, she looked down for the first time. The canyon floor below was maybe 40 feet wide at the camp, wider further in. She could see the camp clearly in the growing light. 4 canvas shelters, a cold fire ring, horses picketed along the east wall, 8 men that she could count, probably more in the shelters. "Kane," Cole said, very low beside her. He was pointing. She followed the line of his arm to a man standing at the camp's edge, looking toward the canyon mouth. He was not particularly remarkable to look at. Medium height, older, maybe 50, with gray at his temples and the ordinary appearance of a man who might run a hardware store or a feed supply. Nothing about his physical form announced what he was. Nothing had to. The way the other men in the camp moved around him, slightly wide, slightly watchful, said it for them. "I see him," she said. Cole's jaw was tight. He was looking at Kane with 3 years of something behind his eyes, and she watched him do the things she'd watched him do with the fence lines and the horses and the hard decisions, the interior processing, the deliberate management of what he felt so that what he did wasn't dictated by it. He looked like he was barely managing it. Below, one of Hale's men moved wrong. A snapped branch, or a boot on loose stone. Something. One of Kane's lookouts turned and shouted, and the canyon erupted. The first shots came from below, Hale's men committing to the approach before they'd reached optimal distance, because there was no other choice now. Kane's men scattered from the camp with the practiced speed of people who had drilled for exactly this contingency. Clara tracked a man running for the east wall and put a round in the stone 2 feet in front of him, and he reversed direction, which was what she'd intended. She wasn't trying to kill everyone, she was trying to move them, disrupt the pattern. Cole was firing in steady, chosen shots. Briggs was on her left, working systematically. Sears had moved further along the rim to cover a blind angle. The canyon was loud and chaotic and full of smoke in the low light. She could hear Hale's voice below giving commands she couldn't make out over the noise. She could see 2 of Kane's men down on the floor, not moving, and 3 others who had found cover behind the rockfall on the west side and were returning fire toward the rim with enough accuracy to force her flat twice. For a while it was just the work, the specific, immediate arithmetic of where to aim and when to move and how much cover she actually had versus how much she thought she had. She moved 3 times along the rim, each time low and fast. Her knee found a sharp rock on the second scramble, and she felt it tear and ignored it. Her burned hand was screaming by the 3rd firing position, and she used it anyway. Below, the push from the canyon floor was working. Hale had gotten his men to the camp, and the fight was collapsing Kane's perimeter, driving men off the west wall. She could see it from above, the geometry shifting, Kane's numbers reducing. 3 of his men broke for the canyon mouth on horses, and Tully and another man cut them off. And there were more shots, and then it was quieter from that direction. Kane was still at the east wall. She could see him, still standing, not running, directing the 2 men left near him with short, controlled gestures. She had a shot. Not a clean one. The angle was difficult and the distance was pushing her limit. She put her finger on the trigger and then held. She looked at Cole. He was looking at Kane too. He'd stopped firing. He was just looking at him, from 60 feet up, across the span of everything that had happened, everything that had been taken, 3 years of silence and a house burned to the ground and a family that didn't exist anymore. His rifle was at his shoulder. "Cole," she said. He didn't answer. Below, Hale was moving on Kane's position from the floor. Kane saw him coming and turned and fired twice. And Hale went down. Not dead.
She could see him moving, but down. And his men faltered and Kane was going to break. She could see it. He was going to get to the horses.
Cole was moving before she could speak again. Not along the rim. Down. He found a descent on the east side, fast and reckless, sliding on limestone, hitting the floor of the canyon at a run. She watched him close the distance with Kane with a kind of relentless, locked-in momentum that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with 3 years of contained grief finally cut loose. Kane turned when he heard him coming. His 2 remaining men were occupied, pinned by Briggs above and Hale's deputies from the floor. It was just the 2 of them in a small open space by the canyon wall, maybe 20 feet apart. Kane looked at Cole and seemed unsurprised. He straightened slowly. He had the specific composure of a man who had made his peace with violent ends long ago. "Mercer," he said. His voice carried up the stone walls. Clara could hear it clearly from the rim. Cole had his rifle up. His breathing was visible in the cold air. "Get your hands where I can see them." Kane raised them slowly, not quickly, in the particular way of someone who is complying with the surface of an instruction while working on something else underneath. He looked at Cole with a flat, assessing calm. "You've been sitting on that hill for 3 years," he said. "Waiting." "I wasn't waiting," Cole said. His voice was tight. "I was done." "But you're here." "You came to me." Kane almost smiled. "I had to know if you were still a threat. You answered that question." A pause. "You should have stayed on your hill, Mercer. You should have stayed done." His eyes moved, barely, just a fraction, to something behind Cole. "Your woman up there on the rim, she's good. Reminds me a little of a—" "Don't," Cole said. The word came out with a force that stopped Kane mid-sentence. Cole's hands on the rifle were steady, but she could see, from above, the tension running through the rest of him. Shoulders, jaw, the set of his feet. 3 years and you still look at me like you want to pull that trigger more than anything you've ever wanted, Kane said. So do it. Or are you going to pretend this is about justice? Clara was already moving down the descent Cole had taken, slower and more careful, rifle across her back. She was not running. She was moving with deliberate, measured pace because she was not panicking. She was making a decision. She hit the canyon floor and crossed the open space and came up beside Cole and put her hand on the barrel of his rifle. Not grabbing it, just her hand resting on it. A weight. Cole's eyes didn't leave Kane. "Don't," she said, low, just for him. "Clara, look at me." She waited. He looked at her. His eyes were the storm gray she'd first seen in a street in Black Hollow, and right now they were dark with something that had been building for 3 years and was very close to the surface. "If you kill him like this," she said, "then he wins. He's been trying to turn you into him since the day you hunted his gang. Don't hand him that." A muscle in his jaw moved. "He killed my family." "I know." She held his eyes. "I know what he took from you. And I know that shooting him in a canyon doesn't bring them back and doesn't make it mean anything. And you know that too, Cole. You have always known that." He was breathing hard. She could feel the tremor in the rifle barrel through her palm. "Ruth wouldn't want this for you," she said. Not as manipulation, as the simple truth she believed. Neither would I. The silence stretched between them, over the distant sounds of the mopping up operation, the horses, the wounded. Kane was watching with an expression that had shifted from calculation to something she couldn't quite read. Cole lowered the rifle. It was not graceful. It was not a moment of serene resolution. He lowered it the way a man puts down something that has been burning his hands, with effort, with the acknowledgement that it costs, with the full understanding of what he's choosing not to do and why. He turned his face away from Kane for one moment, and she saw what 3 years looked like when it didn't get the ending it had been aimed at. His eyes were wet. He pressed his mouth into a line and held it. Then he looked at Kane again. Something had passed, some terrible consuming thing. "Elias Kane," Cole said, and his voice was rough, but it was steady. "You're under arrest for the murder of Ruth Mercer, Daniel Mercer, and Lucy Mercer, and every other thing you've done that this territory is going to hear about in full." Kane looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he had expected from this, it hadn't been this. "You'll regret not finishing it," he said. "Probably," Cole said. "I'll live with it." Hale's deputies came forward and Kane's hands were bound, and he was taken toward the canyon mouth. and Clara watched his face as he passed her. The profile of a man who had broken many things and expected the world to break him back the same way, and was being denied the satisfaction of that symmetry. She thought there might be something worse in that for him than a bullet would have been. She looked at Cole. He was watching Kane go. His face was terrible and raw in the way of things that have been covered for a long time and are suddenly open to the air. She stepped beside him. She didn't touch him. She just stood there, close enough that he could feel she was there, and waited. After a moment, his hand found hers. He held it, not the burned one, the good one, and they stood there in the cold canyon while the sounds of men and horses and the mechanics of aftermath moved around them. Hale was on his feet. He'd taken a shot in the thigh, bad but not catastrophic, and he was being helped, and was loudly objecting to the helping. 2 of Kane's men were dead on the canyon floor. 4 others were in custody. One had escaped through the mouth early in the fight, and Briggs was already tracking him and expressing considerable confidence about the outcome. "Hey," Cole said, after a while. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple thing, said simply, and it carried about 10 different meanings she could identify and probably several she couldn't. "You would have put it down," she said. "Eventually. Maybe." He didn't sound certain, and she respected him for not pretending otherwise. Briggs came back with the escaped man in custody 40 minutes later. He reported this to Hale with the same flat efficiency with which he apparently did everything, and Hale nodded from where he was sitting on a rock having his leg looked at, and said good, in a tone that suggested this was always the expected outcome. The posse began organizing for the ride back. Kane was bound and horsed and flanked by 2 of Hale's men. He didn't speak anymore. He looked straight ahead with the contained expression of a man running internal calculations about future possibilities, and Clara thought about what Hale had said. A case 2 years in the building, stage robberies, murders, the full weight of what the territory would bring to bear. She thought about Kane in a courtroom, in chains, being heard in public. She thought about all the things that would be named correctly and recorded and unable to be hidden. Better than a canyon, she thought. Better by far. She climbed back up to get Margaret, who had been tethered on the rim and was unimpressed with the entire morning. Clara pressed her face into the horse's neck for a moment. Just a moment, her eyes closed, and allowed herself the specific relief of being alive, which she had not had time to feel yet. Her knee was bleeding from the scramble. Her burned hand was going to be a serious complaint for the next several days. She had a bruise along her left side from where she'd hit the limestone on the second scramble down and hadn't noticed until just now. She thought about the ranch, the burned walls, the garden, the tomatoes. Ruth's tomatoes still working their roots through the soil even now, probably, stubborn and unconcerned with human catastrophe. She mounted up. Below, the posse was getting organized. She could see Cole's gray coat moving through the group, talking with Hale, checking on the horses, doing the organized aftermath work of a man who knew how these things needed to be closed out. He looked up at her on the rim. She raised her hand. He held up his. She turned Margaret toward the descent and started down, toward the canyon floor, toward the ride back to Iron Ridge, toward whatever came after the hardest morning of her life. Her hands were shaking, she noticed finally. Now that it was over. Now that her body was apparently willing to report the full inventory. She let them shake. It was just information. It was just the cost of the thing, presenting its accounting after the emergency had passed. She reached the canyon floor. Cole was there, holding his horse, waiting. "You're shaking," he said. "I know. It's normal. I know that too." He looked at her, the whole of her, in the thin morning light, and she looked back at him, and they were both still standing, which was the most important thing and the only thing that needed to be said about it just then. They rode out of Rego Canyon as the sun cleared the rim and the cold began to ease, and behind them the canyon held its dead and its aftermath and the long echo of a thing that was finally, at enormous cost, finished. The trial of Elias Kane opened on a Tuesday in December, in the territorial courthouse at Sandoval, a proper building with a proper judge and a gallery packed so full that men stood 3 deep along the back wall, and the noise outside from those who couldn't get in carried through the windows all morning. Clara sat in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap and watched the proceedings with the particular attention of someone who has a personal stake in whether justice is a real thing or just a word people use when they want to sound better than they are. Kane entered in chains and sat at the defendant's table with the same contained, calculating stillness he'd had in the canyon, and she studied him and tried to find what it was about him that had consumed 3 years of Cole's life and ended 3 other lives entirely. He looked like nothing. That was the disturbing thing. He looked like a hardware man, like someone's uncle. Violence, she had learned, almost never looked like what it was from the outside. Cole testified on the second day. He sat in the witness box and answered the prosecutor's questions in the same flat, factual manner. He did most things, and she watched the jury watching him. 8 men of various ages and occupations who were doing their best to absorb the specifics of what had been done to Ruth and Daniel and Lucy Mercer by the man sitting 20 feet away. She watched their faces as Cole described coming back to the homestead. She watched the particular stillness that came over the jury box, and she thought, they understand now. They understand what this was. Kane's lawyer attempted to suggest that Cole's identification of Kane's involvement was driven by grief rather than evidence. Cole looked at the lawyer for a moment and said, calmly, that he had documented evidence, named witnesses, and 2 confessions from Kane's own men who had accepted plea arrangements, and that grief and evidence were not mutually exclusive. The lawyer moved on. Halle testified on the 3rd day, his leg in a proper brace now, walking with a cane he clearly resented. He laid out 2 years of documented crimes with the methodical precision of a man who had been building to this moment and intended to use every brick. Stage robberies with dates and amounts. 3 murders with names. The names of the dead spoken clearly, into the record, in front of the man who had ordered them killed. Clara watched Kane's face when the names were read. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look away. That bothered her more than emotion would have. She did not testify. Hale had not needed her testimony, and she had not pushed to give it, because she understood that there were times when the most useful thing you could do was stay out of the way and let the machinery work. But she was there every day, in the gallery, which was its own kind of statement. On the 5th day, the jury came back in 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Kane to hang, and the gallery erupted with a sound that was too complex to be called celebration, relief mostly, and the particular exhale of people who had been holding something for a long time and were finally allowed to put it down. Clara looked at Cole when the verdict came. He was sitting 2 rows ahead of her, and he didn't turn around immediately. He sat very still, the way he sat when he was working through something internally. Then he turned and found her face in the crowd, and she held his gaze and nodded once, and he nodded back. Outside the courthouse, in the cold December air, she found him on the steps. He was looking at the street, at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who has been walking toward something for a very long time and has just realized he's arrived and doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of the walking. "It's done," she said. "Yeah." He was quiet. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would." "What did you think it would feel like?" He considered this. "More, I suppose. More like something." He paused. "It just feels quiet." She stood beside him and thought about that. She thought about how vengeance, even when it transforms into justice, even when it takes the correct and sanctioned form, does not actually fill the shape of what was lost. She had known this intellectually, but watching it happen on Cole's face made it specific and true in a different way. The quiet he was describing was the quiet of an absence that had been there all along, that the pursuit of Kane had been a way of not noticing. Now there was nothing between him and it. "The quiet is going to be hard for a while," she said. "I know. And then it'll be something else." She paused. "I can't tell you what, but something else." He looked at her. "You seem very certain." "I'm not particularly," she said, "but somebody in this arrangement needs to act like the future is viable, and you're clearly not up to it right now, so I'm volunteering." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in him shifted. Small, but real. And he almost smiled, the same almost smile she'd first seen in the barn when she named the horse Margaret. "You've been doing that since May," he said. "Acting like the future was viable." "Somebody had to." He took her hand. Not the burned one. The burn had healed into a neat, flat scar across her left palm that she had stopped noticing except occasionally, when light hit it at a certain angle. The good hand. He held it with the careful, specific pressure of a man who knows what he has and intends not to be careless with it. They stood on the courthouse steps while people moved around them, and the cold air smelled of wood smoke and winter. And Elias Kane was in a cell somewhere in the building behind them, and it was finished, and the quiet was hard, and the future was viable. Holden Graves had been dealt with in October, 2 weeks after Black Hollow, not dramatically. Clara had written a letter to the county circuit judge documenting the assault and the false accusation, and Hale had sent his own communication, and the result was that Randall Graves had been quietly, strongly encouraged to resolve the matter before it became a formal proceeding that would be embarrassing to the family name and expensive in other ways. The resolution had included a sum of money and a signed admission that the theft accusation had been fabricated. Clara had accepted the money without satisfaction and the admission without forgiveness, because forgiveness was not the same as justice, and she was done confusing the two. Holden had left Black Hollow by November. She had heard this secondhand from a woman she'd written to in town, a woman named Pryor, the same Mrs. Pryor who had stood at the post office and watched and said nothing. Mrs. Pryor's letter was full of things it didn't quite say, circular and hedged, and Clara had read it twice and understood that it was the closest thing to an apology the woman knew how to write, and she had written back briefly and not mentioned the post office, because carrying every wound indefinitely is expensive in ways she could no longer afford. Sheriff Potts was still in his office. She suspected he always would be. There are men shaped by their cowardice so thoroughly that courage would require dismantling the whole structure, and most of them never get around to it. She had stopped expecting anything from him, which was its own kind of freedom. They stayed in Iron Ridge through December. Hale, while he was healing, had offered Cole and Clara the use of a property he owned on the town's north edge. A small house, nothing remarkable, with a wood stove that worked, and a covered porch, and 2 rooms. They moved into it the day after the verdict like 2 people taking the first careful steps onto uncertain ice, both of them aware that they were now in a different kind of territory entirely. The emergency was over. The pursuit was over. All the things that had been giving their proximity a clear practical justification were gone, and what was left was just the 2 of them, and the question of what that meant. It was strange. She would not pretend it wasn't strange. She and Cole had been living in close quarters for months, but those months had been structured. First her recovery, then the work of the ranch, then the threat, then the canyon. There had always been a function to perform. Now there was just the house and the stove and the mornings, and she found herself uncertain in a way she hadn't been in the middle of a firefight, which said something about her that she was still working out. Cole was uncertain too. She could tell. He moved through the small house with the careful consideration of a man trying not to take up more space than had been allocated to him, which was not a thing she had ever seen him do in any other context. One evening she pointed this out, not unkindly. "You're tiptoeing," she said, "in your own house." "Hale's house," he corrected. "Whatever house. You're treating it like a waiting room." He was quiet for a moment. He had a cup of coffee he'd been holding for 10 minutes without drinking. "I'm trying to figure out what I'm allowed to assume," he said. "About what?" He looked at her directly, which was something he always did when the question was serious. "About you. About this." She looked back at him. The wood stove was crackling and the window had frost at the edges, and she thought about May, about the dirt, about the first sound of his horse coming through the silence of a town that had decided she didn't matter. She thought about Margaret and the tomatoes and the gun lesson and the porch in the evenings and the canyon and his hand finding hers in the aftermath. "You can assume I'm staying," she said. "If that's what you're asking. That's part of it." She waited. Ruth was... He stopped. He tried again. "I'm not the same man I was when Ruth was alive. I'm not certain that's a man you'd have liked." "I don't know that man," she said. "I know this one." "This one is damaged," he said, blunt and straight, the way he was blunt and straight about everything. "So am I," she said. "So is everyone worth knowing?" She set her own cup down. "Cole, I'm not asking you to be whole. I'm not asking you to be finished grieving or finished with whatever the rest of this cost you. I'm asking you to let me be in the room while it's happening, that's all." He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, the frost was thickening on the glass. "That's not a small thing you're offering," he said finally. "I know that. You could ask for more than that." "I'm asking for exactly what I want," she said. Don't tell me what I should want." He looked at her. That almost smile again, and this time it became a real one. Not wide, not easy, just real. The specific authenticity of a man allowing himself something he hasn't allowed in a long time. "No," he said. "You're right. I've seen you shoot." She picked her coffee back up. "I have." They didn't talk more about it that night. They didn't need to. Some conversations are complete at a certain point, and continuing them only dilutes them, and they had both lived enough to know when to leave a thing alone. They found their land in March. It was north of Iron Ridge, farther from everything they'd known. A piece of high ground with a creek that ran year-round, and a south-facing slope that someone with Clara's specific vocabulary of light and soil would have recognized immediately as good land for growing things. The previous owner had died without heirs, and the price was honest. They stood on the slope in early spring and looked at it, and it was raw and unworked and full of potential, which is exactly what they needed it to be. "We'd need to start entirely from scratch," Cole said. "Good," Clara said. "I mean, entirely. No structure's worth keeping. The soil will take a year to get right. I know how soil works. The access road floods in heavy rain." She looked at him. "Are you trying to talk yourself out of it?" He looked at the slope, the creek, the sky. "No," he said. "I'm making sure I'm seeing it clear and buying it anyway." "That's the definition of a good decision," she said. He bought it the following week. They built slowly, which is the only honest way to build anything that's supposed to last. A foundation first, laid by Cole and Briggs, who had taken a liking to Cole in the canyon with the particular loyalty of men who have trusted each other in hard situations and found the trust was warranted. Then the walls, which took the bulk of the summer, Clara working beside Cole every day, her hands developing a new set of calluses on top of the old ones. She had stopped keeping account of the things her hands had learned over the years. It seemed beside the point. There were arguments. She would not pretend otherwise. Cole had opinions about structural things that were sometimes wrong and never easily surrendered, and she had opinions about space and light and how a kitchen needed to function that he initially treated as decorative preferences until she explained, at some length and with some heat, that a kitchen was infrastructure and should be treated accordingly. They reached an agreement on the kitchen. He came around to her position on the window placement. She came around to his on the barn location because he was right about the drainage and she'd been looking at the slope wrong. The arguments were fine. Arguments between people who respect each other are just negotiations, and they were both good at negotiating, and nothing they argued about left a mark that lasted past the resolution. Margaret settled into the new pasture with the calm acceptance of a horse who has learned that wherever Clara is, the situation is probably going to stabilize. The other horses came too, the 3 they'd recovered from the canyon night and 2 new ones Cole bought in summer. The barn was done before the house, which was the correct priority, and Clara said so. And Cole said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. Cole proposed on the porch of the house they'd built, on an evening in October. A year, almost exactly, since the night of the burning ranch. The porch was nothing fancy. 2 chairs and a railing that was solid because he'd learned from the last one. And the evening was cold coming in from the north with the particular clarity that October brought to the Texas hills. He didn't prepare a speech. She was glad. A speech would have been wrong for him, and she'd have known it wasn't really him, and it would have put a false note in something that didn't deserve one. He just said, straight and simple, "I'd like you to stay permanently, in the legal sense, if you'd have me." She looked at him. At the porch they'd built, and the slope below them where the garden was already staked out for spring, and the barn roof catching the last of the orange light. "You're not very romantic," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know that." "I'd have you," she said. They were married in Iron Ridge in November, in Hale's office, with Hale as witness and Briggs standing in the corner looking uncomfortable in a shirt collar, and Sears, the young deputy from the canyon, who had apparently attached himself to the proceedings by simply showing up and nobody having the heart to send him away. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Cole's hand was cold when she took it, and hers was probably cold too. The words were said, the names were signed, and when it was done, Hale shook Cole's hand and then looked at Clara and said, he needed someone who could keep up with him. And she said, "I know." And that was that. Afterwards, the 5 of them ate in the small restaurant across from the marshal's office. And Sears told a story about the canyon climb that was significantly more dramatic than what had actually happened. and Briggs corrected 3 factual errors without expression, and Hale ate his steak with the contentment of a man whose leg had healed properly and whose jurisdiction was measurably quieter than it had been. And Cole was quiet in his good way, the way of a man who is present and at ease rather than absent and enduring. And Clara noticed all of this and found it sufficient, more than sufficient, more than... She thought about things sometimes in the way that survivors think about things, not with regret exactly, but with the thoughtful attention of someone trying to understand the full shape of what happened to them. She thought about Thomas sometimes, less with grief now, and more with the specific warmth of someone who had mattered and was still mattering in ways she was still discovering. She thought he would have liked Cole, on balance. They were different men, but they had the same fundamental quality, the quality of meaning what they said. She thought about Black Hollow less, but sometimes. She thought about the dirt on her cheek and the pale sky above her and the sound of a horse cutting through silence. She thought about what it meant that the worst moment of her life had been the door to everything that came after. And she turned that thought over and examined it and couldn't decide if it was profound or simply true, and eventually concluded that the two things weren't necessarily different. She did not think of herself as rescued. She had thought about this carefully and specifically and reached a clear conclusion. A man had picked her up from the dirt, yes. And that mattered. Kindness in its moment of arrival is not a small thing, and she would never diminish it. But what had happened after, the healing, the work, the learning, the burning and surviving of the ranch, the climb to the canyon rim, the hand on the rifle barrel in the canyon when it mattered most, none of that was done to her. She had done all of it. She had decided every morning to get up and be the person the situation required, and nobody can do that for you. The first child came in the 2nd year of the ranch, a boy they named James. He arrived with significant complaint about the whole process, which Clara regarded as an appropriate response to being born, and he had Cole's gray eyes and her obstinate jaw and no idea, yet, of the particular world he'd been born into or what it had cost to make it safe enough for him. The second, a girl named May, came 2 years after James. She had Clara's brown hair and Cole's systematic approach to problems. She would sit with a stuck latch or a puzzle for 20 minutes, working it, before she'd ask for help, which Clara recognized as both a strength and an inconvenience. The ranch grew by degrees, not dramatically, not in any way that attracted attention or required any particular story to explain. Just the accumulation of seasons and work and decisions made together by two people who had learned to trust each other's judgment in the ways that mattered. Cole still had bad nights sometimes. The north wind still woke him on certain evenings, and she still heard him sometimes moving through the house in the dark, and she still lay awake and waited to see if he needed her or needed the solitude. And she had gotten better at reading which was which. He never apologized for the bad nights, and she never asked him to. Grief, she had decided, is not something that ends cleanly. It just integrates. It becomes part of the architecture rather than a wound in the floor, and you build around it, and sometimes you bump it, and it hurts, and then you keep building. She had her own version of this. The folded letter from Thomas was still in her cedar chest now, no longer carried in her pocket, but not put away either. Present, honored, in its proper place. She still dreamed occasionally about the street in Black Hollow, about the pale sky and the dirt and the waiting. In the dream, she was always in that moment just before the horse came, suspended in the terrible certainty of an ending that hadn't ended. She always woke before she heard the hooves, but she woke on the ranch, in a house she'd built with her own hands, with a man she chose lying beside her, and the dream receded to its correct size. It was James who asked, at age 7, how his parents had met. He asked it at the dinner table with the particular frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that some questions have complicated answers. May, 5, was paying close attention in the way she always paid attention to things she recognized were important. Cole and Clara looked at each other across the table. She saw him running the calculation. How much truth, in what form, for a 7-year-old? She watched him decide. Your mother was having a hard time, Cole said, in a town we used to live near. I saw it happening, and I didn't think it was right. James considered this. What kind of hard time? The kind where people who should have helped didn't, Cole said. So I helped. And then you got married? Not right away, Clara said. We got to know each other first. She paused. Your father taught me to shoot. James's eyes went wide in the direction of interesting. Can you shoot? Better than your father, Clara said. Cole said, That is debatable. It is not debatable, she said. Ask Briggs. Briggs is biased. Briggs keeps a score and you know it. May, who had been listening with her chin in her hand, said, Did you know right away that you'd get married? Clara looked at her daughter, at the small, serious face, the question asked with the genuine philosophical curiosity of a child who is trying to understand how the world works. She thought about the right answer. She thought about the honest one. No, she said. I knew he was a good man. I knew he did the right thing when it cost him something. She paused. The rest took time. How long? Long enough to be sure. May seemed to accept this with the satisfaction of a correct answer. She went back to her dinner. Cole caught Clara's eye across the table and held it for a moment. Just a moment. She knew what was in it. The particular look of two people who have been through enough together that a glance can hold a full conversation. She looked back with the same fullness, and then they both looked at their children, at the table they'd built in the kitchen that had turned out the way she'd argued it should. At the window, the light came through at the angle she'd insisted on, at the ranch visible through that window. The garden, the barn, the pasture where Margaret was standing in the last of the evening light, with the magnificent indifference of a horse who knows her situation is secure. Clara thought about a woman lying in the dirt of a street, looking up at a pale sky, convinced it was over. She thought about all the decisions between that woman and this one. Not one big decision, not one rescuing hand and then a clean arc to a better place. Just the accumulation of small, stubborn choices. To get up, to work, to trust, to fight, to hold a hand back from a trigger, to plant tomatoes in dead soil, to say I'd have you on a porch in October. Nobody hands you a life. You build it in the same ordinary way that you build anything worth having. Imperfectly, with inadequate materials, in weather that doesn't care about your plans, alongside people who are also damaged and trying, one board at a time, for as long as it takes. Outside, the evening was settling over the hills in long, slow light. The children finished eating and ran outside, as children do, toward whatever the yard held that was more interesting than the table. Cole stood and started clearing plates with the particular domestic efficiency he'd acquired sometime around the second year of the ranch, which had startled her the first time she noticed it, and now was just part of who he was. Clara stayed at the table a moment longer. She pressed her left palm flat on the wood, the scarred one, the burn-healed one. The table was solid under her hand, warm from the meal, from the family that had just been sitting at it. She thought, this is what it was for. All of it. The dirt, the fire, the canyon, the long cold rides, and the bad nights, and the mornings when the future looked like a problem with no clean answer. It was for this table. These children, this hand, scarred and able, pressed flat on wood we cut and shaped and built into something that holds. She was not a woman who believed things happened for reasons. The fever had not taken Thomas so that she could find Cole. The beating had not happened so that she could become someone stronger. Bad things happened because the world was careless and cruel and indifferent to individual lives, and that was the truth of it. And she had looked at that truth directly and chosen to build anyway. That was the only story worth telling. Not that the suffering had a plan, but that after the suffering, you could still choose. She got up from the table and went to help Cole with the plates, and outside through the window, the children were running in the last light with the specific freedom of people who have never had to think about whether they are safe. And the ranch held them all in its imperfect, hard-won, entirely ordinary arms. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.